is Janine Kay from CIHI, where she is the manager of data governance and standards. Janine has 20 years of digital health experience, mostly in the area of business intelligence and data warehousing. In the last few years, she has shifted to focus on data governance and master data agreement. You can find more detailed bios on the presenter on our school conference website. So Janine's topic is CIHI Standards 101, creating data standards and governance to support collection, analysis, and reporting. I just have a few housekeeping items here before getting going. So each presenter is going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, followed by 10 minutes Q&A, question and answers. All the presentations will be recorded and made available after the conference. Please mute your microphone and use chat to type in questions or comments for the presenter at any time, or raise your hand to ask questions or make comments during the Q&A after the presentation. And after each session is finished, you can stay on or reconnect again for the next session. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing and hand the microphone over to Janine.
Great, thanks, Francis. All right, I'm just gonna share my screen. Oops. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, I'll get going. After your land acknowledgement, I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Ottawa, which are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and now recognize it's home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I know I'm looking forward a bit to the topics of discussion at the virtual conference. You know, there'll be some topics later on, including my colleague Dana, who's presenting after me on collecting data related to Indigenous identity. So I hope that as the health informatics community, you know, there's a part we can play with the respectful collection of this data with our own journey with truth and reconciliation. Okay, but so as Francis said, my name is Janine Kay. I work at the Canadian Institute for Health Information. I'm the manager for the Data Governance and Standards Office. So I'm gonna, even though my presentation topic is CIHI Standards 101, I'm gonna focus both on governance that sort of underpins having a good governance foundation is great for helping to create high quality data standards. So I'll talk about both those things. I'm also gonna just talk a little bit about CIHI for those who might not be familiar with it. As well as, like I said, our own data governance journey that we've gone on over the last 5 years or so, as well as the standards strategy we've created here and development of standards within CIHI and with some of our partner organizations. Put a few key takeaways on the slide there. I think, you know, as we go through, you'll hopefully see that the creation of certain governance committees has definitely helped us to have a strong foundation that supports our corporate strategies. And we've also created a roadmap that has real tangible activities that have helped us along the way as well. Okay, so about CIHI, for those who might not be familiar with us, we're a not-for-profit organization. We're funded by Health Canada as well as through negotiated agreements with the provinces and territories. And our goal is really to collect and disseminate data on the healthcare system in Canada, particularly health system performance. We're responsible to provide and publicly report on health data information that improves the outcomes of the health system performance and population health across the country. You know, our ultimate vision is really to have healthier Canadians to help and do that through facilitating health system performance with good, high quality data. In terms of, so we're not the only player in this landscape, and I'm sure a lot of folks from some of our partner organizations are on the call today. But in terms of where we fit in the overall landscape,
take a second to click in. Okay,
thank you very much.
No problem.
Oh, sorry, Janine, you're muted.
am I okay now?
Yeah.
I think everybody maybe got muted, so sorry. I'll find where it was. Okay, so where do we fit in the landscape? So in terms of overall population health and public health, Statistics Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada at the federal level obviously play a big role in doing that work. The sort of niche that CIHI plays is related to different types of care, so both acute care in hospitals, long-term care facilities, home care. We have a lot of data on that on health spending and health workforce data, as well as indicator reporting for health system performance. There are some gaps, I think, overall, though, in areas that we're trying to gather more data in general, not just us, but across the landscape out there. We focus on mostly on the publicly funded healthcare system. So there's a big data gap around both primary healthcare, but also services that are privately funded. Things like diagnostic imaging, sometimes lab data, and some services like mental health that are often privately funded. Also, allied health services where people pay out of pocket or through private health insurance, so things like dental care, vision care, things like that. And although we do collect data on some social services, it's not currently very well integrated with the health system data. That is a little bit about us. So now I'm going to move into our CIHI's data governance journey. So when we first started this about 5 years ago, one of the first things we did was sort of define what data governance meant to us as an organization. So this is the definition we've come up with. We want to implement processes and controls to limit the risky things people can and will do with data while optimizing the value of data and use it to create insights that generate impactful action. So you'll see a little bit more how that's actually played out for us, but we know we have a lot of data here at CIHI, and we want to use it to do good in the system, but we also want to make sure that we have high quality data, that the right people are accessing it, and so on. So why is governance so important, data governance so important? Well, I think we're all aware that data is one of the healthcare system's fastest growing assets. In my career over the last 20 or so years, so much of our healthcare data has moved online. And we also have, we all have smartwatches and all sorts of things that are collecting data about us all the time. And so the amount of healthcare data that's out there is just growing and growing exponentially. The other factor is that internationally, there's a lot of regulation that's going on. So if we look at what Europe has done or the OECD, they want to make sure that there's good access to data so that we can use it to improve our healthcare system and generate good public policy. But we also want people to have control over what is done with their healthcare data, because it's obviously can be very powerful if it's not used correctly. So those are some of the reasons just generally why having good governance over our healthcare data assets are so important. And in terms of why it's so important to us here at CIHI, well, we have a huge amount of data. So many terabytes of data, and that's growing year over year. And there's a whole huge range of types of data that we collect. And we want to be able to start to link that data. I mean, obviously, people's experience with the healthcare system, we hope it's not too siloed. There's lots of different places, and people want to have good continuity across that journey. So we do want to be able to link our data and report on a wide range of scenarios. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we have good quality data, that it's managed well, that it's accessed appropriately, linked appropriately, and that we can sort of tell that story across the continuum of care in the health system. Also within our own journey, we're sort of moving from what we're calling a data-driven organization to being a more data-centric organization. One of the ways you can think about that is that, as sort of a series of houses within your community, each house people individually manage what they do with their house. There's sort of below ground services that are governed. But sometimes it can be difficult to connect those things together. People are the experts on their own house, same as we have people right now that are very much experts in a certain domain of data, maybe it be the acute care sector or the home care sector, something like that. But we want to sort of move to communities. We want the communities to be centrally governed. and the data is at the center of that. It can be overall lower to maintain because there's sort of that shared maintenance happening across things, and people become more expert in their community. They're working together to grow that community as opposed to just sort of managing their own house. I think if we think about it, in terms of like an actual example related to data, if you have all these different data sets you're acquiring and they all have different data models, and you drop them into this big data lake without any attempt to sort of harmonize, you're sort of more in that data-driven side versus the data-centric, and you're not getting as much value from your data. But if you can create a shared data model for all of those things, then it makes it much easier to use and interpret the data that you're collecting. It's much more agile with the way that you're working. So in terms of where we've been, back in the spring of 2018, internally, we had created a couple of white papers, one on data governance, one on standards governance, and kind of what the landscape looked like and where we wanted to be at CIHI. And through that, we made a number of recommendations on what we should do for our own governance journey. The first step that we decided to take was to create some internal governance committees. So we have two that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail. And we also started to name data stewards across the organization. So we have over 200, I would say now, that have been named for all different topics, both technical and stewards and business data stewards for lots of topics. And a subset of those members sit on our committees, but they can reach out to that larger stewardship network within the organization. And the idea is that people can know who to go to. And on my team, we have all of our master data stewards. So if I think of the example of our organization data stewards, so we actually have a data set that manages all the organization information. So in terms of like all the hospitals and the long-term care facilities and so on. And the person that sits in that role was originally just looking at that particular data set and how it's used. And it's really, we collect that data mostly to use organization information for reporting, but her role is now sort of expanded as the organization steward. She is aware of how organization information is used across the organization in different databases. So it would include our customer support database, where people can answer questions and sign up for education courses and things like that, as well as how that data is used in all our different databases and reporting and access to our data set. So it's, even though she still has sort of management over that one particular database, she sort of has to think about how all that data works together across the organization and creating a true master data asset. We also then have created the health data information capability framework, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And it's a publicly available document framework. We wanted to sort of improve the language people use across the country to talk about data and information governance. And it allows them to sort of measure themselves to where they're at currently and where they want to be in the future in terms of their level of capability with data information governance. And we use that internally ourselves to create our data information governance roadmap each year. So we look at where we're at in particular competencies in that framework and then decide where we want to be and look at some of the strategic initiatives that are happening across the organization that will help us move there. And then those are some of the things that come to our various governance committees. Okay, so I'll go into a little bit more detail about those things. So this is the high-level overview of the health data information capability framework. So there's a couple ways that it's stratified. One is sort of topic areas. So at a high level, there's capabilities related to strategy and governance, policies and procedures, resources and standards, and then people and knowledge. And then within these, there's also competencies that are considered core, foundational, and then supplemental and enabling. And so in the early days, CIHI focused on a lot of the strategy and governance areas as we set up our program, but we also looked at and evaluated ourselves on the core and foundational capabilities because those were where we really wanted to start. So as we go on, this year, we're now focusing a little bit more on the people and knowledge and building our internal knowledge and a few other key areas as well. Oops. And then I was talking a little bit about some of our governance groups. So obviously, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of data related activities going on. We really are a data organization. But historically, sometimes these have happened in very isolated ways. But as we get more and more into sort of integrated reporting and having changing the way that we hold all of our data, moving into the world of data lakes and cloud computing and things like that. We want to make sure things are being done consistently, and we have good governance structures over all of our data. So we created 2 committees that support this. The first is the Data Information Governance Committee that's a little bit more strategic. That's the group that develops our roadmap, contributes to that. And we ensure there's sort of broad coordination across the organization on some of those data related activities. And as I mentioned, we also develop and monitor our data information governance roadmap. Generally, it's at the manager level in the organization, but it's also co-chaired by some directors. And then to support that, we have a stewardship council. So from that group of stewards, we've identified some key folks to represent specific areas, and it's a bit more operational. So the types of information that go there are still related back to the DIG roadmap, but we want to make sure there's consistent use of data information standards, and the folks that sit at that council provide a lot of input based on their own experience and their network of stewards to help identify gaps and hopefully produce good quality standards and support of some of the activities that are on the roadmap. So this is just to show, this was based on, some people may be familiar with the DAMA wheel for data governance, and there's different subject areas there. So that's what's represented by the data management stewards. There's 10 of them that focus on different areas. And we have people from across the organization that sort of have specialization in some of these areas that are represented on the council. We also have 6 standard stewards that represent the different types of data standards, data information standards, I guess. And then from the different database areas we also have 9 enterprise business data stewards to make sure we've got a good focus on those. So right now, the total membership in the Stewardship Council is 24 people. And from this, we have a good cross section of the organization, both on our IT side as well as our business side. And as I mentioned, all of that is sort of governed by, we use our DIG roadmap to sort of talk about the different types of things that we're going to be working on over the course of the year and focusing our attention on. Some of the reasons we created the roadmap, where we want to govern those data assets and a real coordinated approach across the organization. We want to improve our capability for that health data information framework that I showed you previously. So where we might not be at the desired capability level, we want to move to a higher level. We want to make sure we're leveraging all the expertise we have across the organization. And generally, it provides focus for the activities that we're doing within our data and information governance agenda. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what's on our roadmap, and a lot of it is related to standards. So initially, we were spending a fair bit of time sort of just defining the roles and responsibilities of these committees in relation to some of the other committees that we already had within the organization, and also bringing in some of the work that was done by various working groups under the umbrella of these committees too, so we can sort of streamline some of those processes. This year, we're also going to be focusing, as I mentioned, a little bit more on education on some of the topics across the organization. We also used it to help implement our standard strategy and help prioritize the work that's being done there. The Stewardship Council in particular sees a lot of information on standards that are in development and also helping to implement those standards, because it's one thing, I'll talk about that when we get to the standards portion of the presentation, but it's one thing to actually create a standard. It's a whole other thing to actually implement that standard. So we have some key projects going on right now. We're creating a big data lake and data hub that'll support our future reporting at CIHI. And so there's lots of standards that need to go into creating that. We have a new database that's starting up related to organ donation and transplantation. So some new standards there. There's been some redesign work recently on our health human resource data. And also, as many of you may have seen through the course of the pandemic, a lot of services have gone virtual. And so there's a lot of new data collection standards across our databases related to virtual care as well. We also are working to build out the amount of metadata that we have that supports all of this data. So it's really a key thing to have consistent information about our data that's easily accessible both internally and externally, and understanding where all the data comes from. So that's a big piece of work that's going on. And I know we'll hear more today about some of the equity measures that we've been working on as well. And then one other thing I thought I would point out, we've worked on, as we start to get more and more into using AI and cognitive computing, working more in R and Python, we've started to think about an ethics framework for our data and analytics as well. And I think these presentations will be shared later. So I just put in some information from our website that people might be interested in with some links. So that Health Data Information Governance and Capability Framework. We also have a longstanding information quality framework that many may be familiar with, privacy and security framework. We've been working on it. It's not published, but we do have internally a data and analytics ethics framework. And then also I know Dana, who's presenting after me, is going to be talking a little bit more about our Indigenous data governance as well. And we have some documentation about what we're doing there on our website as well. Okay, so now I'm going to move into a little bit more about what we're doing for standard strategy and development. So in terms of some of the where it fits in our overall strategy at CIHI, we've just launched our new strategic plan. So I've put in a link there to that in terms of what we're planning on doing for the next 5 years at CIHI. And so that, at a very high level, guides our work. And then we have a couple of other strategies and plans. So we know that we have a standard strategy, which is helping us to actually collect the data that we need to meet some of these other organizational needs. So we want to make sure that we're setting good standards to collect the data and to also report on the data right from the get-go. And we know the kinds of analysis that we want to do in the future. So that supports our data advancement strategy as well. So that's where I mentioned earlier some of the gaps that we have in the data that we collect, that we want to learn more about some of those sectors. So if we think about the data we want to collect, having standards to collect that data is important. And then that all feeds into our analytical plan. So that's the types of things that we're going to be reporting on. So sometimes we retire old indicators and we're developing new indicators all the time to inform sort of key areas. So over the course of the pandemic, we pivoted a bit to do some reporting on topics related to the pandemic. So all of these work really closely together to support our overall strategic plan. Even sort of predating our standards strategy, we had the standards framework. So you'll notice that as I mentioned before, even within the standards land space, obviously in healthcare, CIHI is not the only player. We also work with Statistics Canada and Canada Health Infoway, who you hear and know a lot from tomorrow in terms of the development of standards. So we've divided the types of standards into the 5 that you see here. CIHI, definitely works on data standards. So things like our MIS, the financial data. We have a CRDM, a relational data model that has standards for the collection of some common fields that go across our different databases. We've developed lots of different types of information standards. Our case mix grouper, some people may be familiar with, and HSMR is the hospital-specific mortality ratio, and other things like that, where we take what we have already in our data and create some additional information standards. Different code sets, ICD-10, CA, and CCI are something that obviously CIHI is very involved in creating. We work closely with folks that develop the INRI standards and lots of others as well. And then we also have specific privacy and security standards that we create just to make sure we can maintain our prescribed entity status within Canada to actually collect all the data that we have. So really, this is all about making sure we have the right standards in place to create the information and actionable data and products that we put out there. So in terms of how we decide what standards need to be developed, we've been putting the standard strategy and the plan that's attached to that is really about trying to figure out how we use our limited resources wisely to tackle the standards that are most important to support our strategic plan. So the ones that we've put highest priority on are those that we either develop, support, or use at CIHI, and also have a high impact across the organization. So there may be times that we look at a very specific standard that's particular to one area, but generally the ones that come to our governance committees are ones that are going to be touching a lot of places across the organization. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Obviously, we also look at in order to, corporate strategic needs are obviously guided by the health system and our stakeholder needs as well. So that feeds into the prioritization as well. Why go about identifying these priority standards? Really, we want to make sure we're prioritizing the ones that make the biggest impact to our strategic plan. Obviously we want to have good high quality data that we're collecting, which produces high quality analysis. We want, in order to work with that, we definitely want our data to be integrated and comparable. So good standards support that. And we also want to make sure we're sharing knowledge across the organization so that the right people know it's the knowledge isn't sort of siloed or compartmentalized across the organization, and that it's really transparent and easy for people to use the data. So both internal to the organization and external as well. So here's just a few examples of some of the ones that we've prioritized recently. Our reference data model, the CRDM, these generally contain concepts that are widely used across the organization. So some of the ones that we've looked at Stewardship Council in the past couple of years are things like employment status, ethnic origin, our sex and gender standard, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, as well as others. Dana's going to be talking a little bit more about the work we've done with our race-based data and Indigenous data governance. And those have come to both Stewardship Council and DIGC. In terms of our master data, we have been doing more and more to sort of master our geography data. So some examples of types of standards there. There's a urban, rural, and remote standard that was worked on a few years ago. Last year, we talked about how we would trend data. Many of you may know there's been lots of different regional changes in Canada over the last few years. And so how we trend data when there may be changes with the regional status is something that's worked on with the geography data. Virtual care, as I mentioned, has been a topic. So things like the different, standardizing the way we collect data about the type of virtual care, like the actual encounter mode. So whether it's a video conference or a teleconference or an email, things like that, as well as providing some more details on the different provider types, who's actually providing that care. And we've also been using that for a collection of primary care. So harmonizing between those data sets as well. There was also a standard we've worked on to how to build an episode of care for mental health patients, because how do you define when does an episode of care for someone who's experiencing mental health care challenges start and end exactly. So, and how we use that in some of our analysis, that was something that was discussed. My group has also been working on a standard for age. So we have different types of software, and some of them actually have built-in calculations for age, but they can produce slightly different results. So we've got a standard that can be used regardless of what software you're using to calculate age. So it's consistent, because things like how you handle someone who's born in a leap year can, and exactly what measures you use, like age at what time within the encounter, can have an effect as well. Okay. So we created a standards process flow to help us create, and this is something that's actively being worked on and refined. So it's got 5 broad steps, which are here, but I've put in sort of some of the more detailed steps. So once we've identified a standard that's a priority that we want to develop, we sort of have people go through these steps, and at different points along the way, there's gates where we want them to come to some of the different committees before they move forward. As we've gone through this process, it reminds people that they should look at what the existing standards are when they're developing the new standard, looking at what our internal business needs and constraints might be for that standard, making sure we work with the right external stakeholders to validate that standard. And then, we've been finding once we've actually defined the standard, tested it out, so the hardest part is often the implementation of that standard and the steps you have to go through to sort of take what we've currently got and transition to the new standard and getting people to collect that data. We don't always have the ability to mandate collection of data in a new way. Sometimes we have a role to play in that, but that's definitely been one. Having it done in a very consistent way has been something that we've been trying to tackle, and I think we'll continue to work on that over the next few years. So this is sort of the process we've been refining this. So I think one of the things I've learned recently is knowing how you're going to report on the data is very important when you're actually developing the standard in the first place. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that. I know we're getting close to time here. So just to end off, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of one success story and maybe one developing story, I guess. So a few years ago, everyone who is using our geographic data with their data sets, we collect postal codes either from the organization or patients in a lot of our data sets. And we had a lot of geographic data that could be assigned to stratify the population that came from StatsCan and Canada Post. But actually figuring out how to apply that to your own data set could be really complex. And some of the values are sort of distributed by percentage. So it wasn't always, people weren't always applying things in the same way. We wanted some consistency. So our solution was that we created a geographic assignment program. So a SAS code that anyone could use. They just needed to select the variables that they wanted and take the, input their data set, and it would assign everything for them using the most appropriate method by someone who, our geography steward, who was, knew exactly how to use that data very well. And then from there, we've actually gone and added the most common geographic variables to what we call our general use data files so that people don't even have to run the code anymore. And then so that would mean that we could even remove postal codes, which are considered personal health information, from a lot of our data sets to help contribute to sort of the need to know privacy best practices. So people have been really appreciative of this. It's certainly meant for more consistent application of that geography data, better quality data consistent across our different analysis, and also efficiency gains for the analytical staff. So people don't have to spend their time trying to figure out these variables and applying them to their data set. It's just all done for them. And one that we've actually been working, we've been a part of the work that Dr. Law has been doing for the last few years, and many across Canada and internationally, is looking at the state of our data that we collect on sex and gender. So a few years ago, this was sort of the current state of our sex and gender data. We were using the terms interchangeably. We had language that was outdated and then sometimes harmful to folks. So we looked at this, just some examples from some of our different databases. And so we wanted to make sure that we addressed some of those challenges. So one of the first things we did was to come up with a new standard. So we've worked, and this may continue to evolve, but we wanted to make sure we were clearly defining both sex at birth and gender appropriately, and what was going to be collected from those different databases. So now we have sort of one enterprise standard that we're hoping to move towards as an organization in all of our different databases. It'll take time, but it's definitely something that we want to do. So you can see the standard there. And then as part of that too, this has been partially implemented, but one of the things that we did was to accurately label existing fields. So instead of using sex and gender interchangeably, in some cases where we know that the data that may be coming from a health card number or health card could be sex or gender, because people are able to change the information that's on that health card now. We've now relabeled it in some of our databases as recorded sex or gender. And then we're looking at actually separating it out into two fields, which I think tends to be a best practice in some places, so that we have both of those pieces of information where applicable. And we'll continue to work with external folks to make sure that what we defined as that standard is appropriate. We can collect that data in a respectful manner. And then slowly over time, we'll be able to integrate that new standard into all of our databases. And then also the downstream products as well. So things like our case mix grouper and our indicators too will all have that, reflect that updated data. So like for data governance, I've included some standards resources. So we have our reference data model toolkit that has a lot of that's publicly available on our website, how we define the common terminology as well as the lookup values for those. We have a data standards page on our internet website. So you can see some of the things that some of the standards that are in development right now, as well as a list of our data standards by data holding. And then of course, we also have our indicator library for those of you that may be familiar with CIHI. So you can see all the metadata that we have on our health indicators that we calculate, and it's all in one location, as well as there's links to the actual indicators as well. And then, yeah, looking forward, so we want to keep working on this process to implement new standards that have been developed or updated, because it's definitely one that's been difficult to tackle over time. But we're working on it collectively to make sure we actually are implementing some of those new standards that we create. We also want to grow our internal standards expertise across the organization through our network of data stewards. And we want to continue to work closely with some of the external stakeholders that were mentioned today and our partners as we develop those new data standards, share best practices, and make sure that they're being adopted in a sensitive way. Okay, so that was all I had for now. I will stop sharing. So I don't know if there's been any questions that are coming in.
Thank you, Janine, for the presentation. It's very concise and informative, so thank you.